I accidentally won $50 in an online lottery, but I got a bank notification, a deposit of $50 million. I couldn't believe my eyes and thought it was a mistake. But when I called, the manager whispered 3 words to me. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that your life can change in a single second. I used to smile politely when I heard that. I was a practical woman, a nurse. I believed in slow, grinding reality, the kind that smells like hospital antiseptic and tastes like lukewarm vending machine coffee at 2 in the morning. I did not believe in seconds that changed everything. And then, one Tuesday evening in March, I understood, with the clarity of a punch to the chest, that those people were absolutely right. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I was 47 years old and I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, on the 2nd floor of a building that made a sound like an old man sighing every time the wind came off the river. I had a daughter, Emma, 16, sharp-tongued, terrifyingly smart, and the single best thing that had ever happened in my otherwise unremarkable life. I had a job I was proud of, 12-hour shifts in the cardiac care unit at Ohio Health Riverside Methodist. I had a car with a cracked dashboard that I kept meaning to fix, and I had debt, the quiet, respectable kind that doesn't scream but never quite leaves the room either. Medical school loans I'd taken for a degree I never finished, the divorce settlement from 4 years ago, Emma's braces, Emma's school fees, Emma's everything. Not that I ever resented a single penny of it. Mark and I had ended things without drama, which I suppose was its own kind of cruelty. 4 years of slow erosion, and then one Sunday morning he said he wasn't happy, and I realized I hadn't been either. And we sat there over coffee in our kitchen on Bryden Road, looking at each other like 2 people who had been waiting a long time for the other person to say it first. He moved to Portland. We split what little we had. I kept Emma. I kept the debt. I kept going. That was my life before. Ordinary. Tight. Mine. On the evening of March 14th, I was sitting on the couch in my living room in my scrubs, too tired to change, eating crackers with peanut butter because I'd worked a double and hadn't had time to grocery shop. Emma was at her friend Kayla's house. The apartment was quiet in that particular way it gets when a teenager is absent. A stillness with a shape to it, like something waiting to be filled. I had my phone in my hand and the television on but muted, and almost without thinking, I opened the app for the Ohio Online Lottery. I did this maybe once every 2 or 3 months, $5, a small harmless ritual, the equivalent of throwing a penny into a fountain. I bought a ticket. I watched the little animation spin, and then the screen told me I had won $50. I laughed out loud, a real laugh, surprised out of me. $50. Not life-changing, but genuine. Dinner for 2. A week's worth of groceries if I was careful. I screenshotted it to send to Emma. I was already composing the text. Guess who just got rich? When my phone buzzed with a push notification from my bank. I almost didn't open it. I almost sent the text first, but I opened it. The notification read, "A deposit of $50 million has been made to your account ending in 4471. I stared at it. I closed the app and opened it again. The number was still there, $50 million. The period, the zeros, the comma in exactly the right place. I counted the digits 3 times, sitting very still on my couch with a cracker halfway to my mouth, as if moving might make the screen change. My first thought was spam. My second thought was a bank error. My third thought, the one that came with a strange electric warmth spreading up through my sternum, was something I immediately pushed back down because I was a practical woman, and practical women do not allow themselves to feel hope before they have information. I called the bank. The automated system tried to redirect me twice. I pressed 000 until a human voice picked up. A man, calm and professional, who asked for my account number and the last 4 digits of my Social Security. I gave them. I heard him typing. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 8 seconds, but felt considerably longer, and then his voice dropped. Not to a whisper exactly, but low enough that I pressed my phone hard against my ear and held my breath. He said 3 words, "Come in tomorrow." That was all. Then, at full volume again, "Ma'am, we'd like to discuss your account in person at your earliest convenience. Our Broad Street branch opens at 9. Ask for Mr. Paulson." He ended the call before I could ask a single question. I sat on my couch until 11:30 that night, the television still muted, the crackers uneaten, staring at the ceiling of my apartment and thinking about my father, a man I had not spoken to in 17 years, a man I had convinced myself I had made peace with not knowing, and wondering for the first time in a very long time what exactly he had left behind when he died. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. I lay in the dark with my eyes closed, listening to the building breathe, but sleep didn't come. What came instead were memories I hadn't visited in years, surfacing one by one like objects rising to the top of muddy water. My father, Robert Calloway. I had taken my ex-husband's last name when I married and kept it after the divorce because Emma had it too, and so my father and I had carried different names for the last decade of what I loosely called our relationship. He was a civil engineer who had spent 40 years being brilliant in a very particular, very narrow way, and impossible in every other way. Proud, distant. We had a falling out when I was 30 over something that felt enormous at the time and now felt like a scar I'd had so long I'd forgotten how I got it. We stopped speaking. I heard through my Aunt Linda, his older sister, that he'd retired to Arizona, that he'd gotten sick, that he died 8 years ago, quietly, in a hospital outside of Phoenix. Linda had called me when he died. I still remembered standing in the hospital parking lot, still in my scrubs, gripping the phone and feeling the specific numbness of grief for someone you'd already been grieving for years. Linda had said there wasn't much. She said Robert had not been careful with his money in his later years. She said the estate had debts. She said she was handling everything, and there was nothing for me to worry about. I had believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was family. The Broad Street branch of Heartland. First Federal opened at 9. I was there at 8:52, wearing my good blazer over clean jeans, carrying a folder with my ID, my bank statements, and a printed screenshot of the notification, as if evidence of what I'd seen on my own phone might somehow be required. The branch manager, Mr. Paulson, was a compact man in his early 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He shook my hand, led me to a private office, closed the door, and sat down across from me with an expression I recognized from my years in nursing. The careful, practiced calm of someone about to deliver news of significant weight. He explained it methodically. 8 days earlier, the probate court of Maricopa County, Arizona, had issued a final distribution order for the estate of Robert James Calloway. The estate, which included real property, investments, and liquid assets, had been in probate litigation for some time. Under the terms of the original will, the primary beneficiary was his only child, Sarah Marie Calloway Mitchell. The distribution was to be processed through a trust account and then transferred to the beneficiary. Due to what Mr. Paulson carefully described as a processing irregularity, an error in the routing instructions from the estate's custodian, the entire sum had bypassed the trust intermediary and landed directly in my personal checking account. $50,240,000. I sat very still. I asked him to repeat the part about the will. He did. Robert Calloway had written a will leaving his entire estate to me. It had been filed with the court and was a matter of public record. I was the legal beneficiary. I asked him why I hadn't known about this. He looked at me carefully. He said that was a question for an estate attorney, not a bank manager. I drove home on autopilot. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going upstairs. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my Aunt Linda. She answered on the second ring, warm and immediately chatty, asking how Emma was, how my shifts had been going. Her voice was the voice of a woman with nothing to hide. I said, "Linda, did Dad leave a will?" A pause. Small, but real. "Honey, we talked about this. The estate was a mess." "There wasn't." "There was a will," I said. "It left everything to me. The court just executed the distribution." The pause this time was longer, and when she spoke again, her voice had a texture to it that I had never heard before. Something carefully composed, like a face being rearranged behind a closed door. She said, "Sarah, let's not do this over the phone. There's a lot of context you don't have." Context. 8 years of silence, and she called it context. I got off the call before I said something I couldn't take back. I sat on my kitchen floor. I didn't even make it to the couch. And I thought, with a clarity that felt almost physical, about what it meant, that Linda had known, that her son Brad, my cousin, who worked in financial services in Scottsdale and whom I'd always found slick and slightly unpleasant, had almost certainly known. That for 8 years, while I was working double shifts and rationing groceries and lying awake worrying about Emma's college tuition, there had been money. My money. My father's gift to me. The fear came first. It was a cold animal fear. The fear of something enormous I didn't understand yet. And then, underneath it, something harder. Something with an edge. By the time Emma came home that evening, I had a plan. I was going to get an attorney. I was going to get every document I was entitled to. And I was going to do all of it before Linda or Brad had any idea what was coming. Because if they had hidden this from me for 8 years, they had resources and experience in this particular game that I lacked. The only advantage I had was that they didn't know yet what I knew. I made Emma her favorite dinner, pasta with the sauce from scratch, the way she liked. I listened to her talk about school. I smiled at the right moments, and inside, very quietly, I began to build. I found Rebecca Holt through the hospital's Employee Assistance Program, which offered 3 free hours of legal consultation for staff. I used those 3 hours on a Thursday morning before my shift, sitting in a small office that smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee. And within 20 minutes, I understood that what I needed was not 3 free hours, but a real attorney on retainer. Rebecca was in her early 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of unhurried, precise manner of speaking that I instinctively trusted. She was a probate and estate litigation specialist. When I finished telling her everything, she leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Tell me again what your aunt said when you asked about the will," she said. I repeated Linda's exact words. "There's a lot of context you don't have." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That's not the answer of someone who didn't know." She took me on. I pulled money from my, now frozen, pending legal review. account to cover the retainer, which the bank had allowed me to do via written authorization from Mr. Paulson once the legal situation became clear. Rebecca immediately began requesting documents: the original probate filing, the will itself, all correspondence between the estate and the court, the records of the trust that had supposedly been managing the distribution. What she found, piece by piece over the next 10 days, was a story. My father had drafted his will 7 years before his death. It was simple and unambiguous, everything to his daughter, Sarah Marie Calloway Mitchell. He had filed it with an estate attorney in Phoenix named Gerald Torres. When Robert died, Gerald Torres had properly filed the will with the Maricopa County Probate Court. The estate, which included a portfolio of real estate investments my father had quietly built over 30 years, was worth approximately $52 million at the time of his death. Aunt Linda had immediately contested the will. Her grounds were vague and, according to Rebecca, legally thin, claims that Robert had not been of sound mind in his final years. But what had happened was more interesting than a simple contest. Buried in the probate record, in a filing from 6 years ago, was a document I had never seen and never signed. A notarized statement of voluntary waiver, purportedly signed by me, Sarah M. Mitchell, relinquishing my claim to the estate in exchange for a cash payment of $10,000. I had never signed any such document. I had never received $10,000 from the estate. I had never even known the estate existed. Rebecca sent the document to a forensic document examiner, a former FBI analyst named Dr. Kwan, who reviewed the signature and the notarization stamp. The results came back in 9 days. The signature was not consistent with my known handwriting. The notarization stamp had been used on several other documents by a notary in the Phoenix area, who had since had his license revoked for unrelated fraud. Someone had forged my signature and filed it with a probate court to legally cut me out of my own inheritance. The day Rebecca called me with Dr. Kwan's findings, I was standing in the parking lot of the hospital at the end of a 12-hour shift, and I had to sit down on a concrete parking barrier because my legs stopped working properly. I stared at the line of cars and thought about the word forgery. It was a word I associated with movies and historical scandals. Not with my Aunt Linda, who had sent me a Christmas card every year without fail, who had called me after my divorce to say she was sorry, who had once, when I was a child, braided my hair on a summer porch in Cincinnati and smelled of sunscreen and talcum powder. What kind of person does that? Meanwhile, something else had been developing. 3 days after I had spoken to Linda on the phone, my cousin Brad had sent me a text message. "Hey, Sarah. Hope you and Emma are doing well. Haven't talked in a while. Mom mentioned you called. Miss you guys." I had stared at that text for a long time. Brad and I had not had a real conversation in over 4 years. His idea of maintaining family contact was a generic happy birthday post on social media once a year. He followed the text with a second one. 2 days later. "Let me know if you ever need anything. Seriously. Family's family." Then a LinkedIn connection request. Brad worked in private wealth management. He knew how to read financial signals. He had almost certainly spoken to Linda after my call. They were testing the temperature. They were listening. And whatever my tone on the phone had told them, it had been enough to put them on alert. Rebecca told me what this meant. We had a window, but it was closing. We needed to move. I nodded. I thought of the forged signature. My own name on a document I'd never touched, filed in a courthouse in a state I hadn't visited in 15 years. I thought about the years of double shifts and crackers with peanut butter and lying awake in the dark with the weight of Emma's future pressing on my chest. I thought, no more waiting. Rebecca filed the civil complaint on a Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Brad had called my cell phone 4 times. I let it go to voicemail. I was at work, back in the cardiac unit, changing a patient's dressing with the particular focused calm that nursing requires, and I felt the buzzing in my pocket each time with something approaching satisfaction. Let him call. After my shift, I sat in my car and listened to the voicemails in order. The first 3 were variations on a theme. Sarah, we need to talk. This is all a misunderstanding. Please call me back. The 4th was different. His voice was tighter, stripped of the performative warmth he usually deployed. Sarah, I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop and think very carefully before you go further with this. There are things you don't understand about Dad's situation. Call me tonight. I deleted all 4 and drove home. He called twice more that evening. Just before 9 o'clock, he stopped calling and sent a text instead. Meet me tomorrow. Neutral location. We can sort this out without lawyers. I showed it to Rebecca, who told me not to meet him anywhere without her present, and certainly not without documentation. I didn't respond. The following evening, a Wednesday, Brad called one more time. I answered. I don't know exactly why. Maybe I wanted to hear what he would say now that he knew we had filed. Maybe I needed to understand who these people actually were, now that the years of surface warmth had been stripped away. He was quiet for a moment when I answered. Then, "You're making a mistake." "Brad, listen to me. You haven't considered what this does to the family, what it does to Mom. She's 69 years old, Sarah. She filed a forged document with a probate court," I said. "That is not what happened. A forensic document examiner says otherwise." Another silence. Then his voice changed in a way that sent something cold through me. Still controlled, but with an edge underneath. The voice of someone who had stopped trying to persuade and started trying to calculate. "Emma applied for the Riverside Community Foundation scholarship last month," he said. $30,000. Renewable for 4 years. I know the board chair, James Whitfield. We play golf." I did not say anything. "I'm just saying," Brad continued, "that there are a lot of moving parts in a situation like this. People who could be helpful or not so helpful, depending on how this goes." I said, "I will see you in court." And I hung up. My hands were not shaking. That surprised me. I felt cold and very clear, the way you feel during a genuine emergency. Not panic, but the opposite of panic. I called Rebecca immediately and documented the conversation in a follow-up email while the details were fresh. The threat regarding Emma's scholarship was explicit enough to matter. 3 days later, Emma mentioned that a car had been parked across the street from our building 2 evenings in a row. A silver SUV she didn't recognize. She mentioned it the way teenagers mention things, casually as an observation rather than a concern, and then went back to her phone. I noted the make and approximate model and filed a report with the Columbus Police Department. Not because I expected immediate action, but because I wanted a paper trail. Rebecca noted it as well. If Linda and Brad were surveilling me, I wanted every instance documented. It was Rebecca who suggested I take a few days away. "You're no use to yourself burned out," she said, with the pragmatic kindness of someone who had seen litigants destroy their own cases through exhaustion and emotional erosion. "The next phase is going to require everything you have. Take Emma somewhere. Disconnect. Come back ready." I listened to her. I booked 4 nights at a small rental cabin in Hocking Hills, 2 hours south of Columbus, in the hills, surrounded by trees that were just beginning to turn green at the tips with early spring. No cable, minimal cell service. Emma thought it was a spontaneous adventure. She spent most of the first day complaining about the Wi-Fi, and then gradually, as the trees and the quiet did their work, She stopped complaining and started talking, really talking, the way she rarely did at home, tangled in the ordinary routines and frictions of our regular life. We hiked. We cooked together. We sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the darkness come in over the hills. Emma told me about a boy she liked at school, and about her plans after graduation, and about how she wanted to study environmental law. I listened to every word. I thought, this is what I am fighting for. Not the money, or not only the money. This, her future, unencumbered. The life my father had apparently wanted to give us, which had been taken and sat in someone else's pocket for 8 years while we went without. On the 4th evening, I sat alone on the porch after Emma had gone inside. The stars were very clear over Hocking Hills. I breathed in the cold air and felt myself settle, the way a suspension bridge settles after the vibration passes, not rigid but stable. I was ready to go back. We drove back to Columbus on a Sunday, and by Monday morning I was back in the unit, back at the rhythms of the job, back inside the particular discipline of caring for people whose hearts were misbehaving. There is something grounding about hospital work that I have always been grateful for. It reminds you that the world is full of people in real crisis, which has a way of calibrating your sense of proportion. Not that my situation lacked proportion, but Hocking Hills had given me distance, and distance had given me clarity. The call from Linda came on a Tuesday evening. I was washing dishes when the phone rang. Her name on the screen, the same name I'd seen there all my life with the uncomplicated warmth of family. Now it looked different. I dried my hands and answered. She opened with small talk. My health, the weather in Phoenix, a vague reference to spring. Then, "Sarah, I've been doing a lot of thinking." "I'm sure you have," I said. "I know this situation is complicated, and I know you're upset, but I want you to consider something." She paused, and in the pause I could hear her composing herself, choosing words that had probably been rehearsed. "Brad and I are willing to offer a resolution. We've spoken to our attorneys. We think we can put together $2 million for you. A clean settlement, no court, no depositions, no dragging the family through all of this. $2 million. 10 years ago, the words would have lit something desperate in me. $2 million was more money than I had ever imagined possessing. It would pay Emma's college. It would pay my debts. It would let me stop counting dollars at the grocery store. $2 million was, by any measure I had ever applied to my own life, an enormous sum. But it was not $50 million. And $50 million was what my father had left me, what had been taken from me by a forged document and 8 years of calculated silence. I said, "No." Linda's voice shifted slightly, still warm but thinner somehow. The warmth stretched over something harder underneath. "Sarah, you need to think about this practically. Litigation is expensive, it's exhausting, and you don't know what you'll find when this really gets into the courts. Robert had a complicated life. There are things that—" "Linda," I said quietly, "I have a forensic document examiner's report that says you filed a forged waiver in my name. I have an attorney who knows probate law very well, and I have all the time in the world. Goodbye." I ended the call, set the phone on the counter, and finished washing the dishes. Was I certain? In that moment, did I feel the unshakable confidence of someone who knows they will win? No. I felt the specific fear of someone standing at the edge of something very large, looking down. $2 million and an exit ramp, or $50 million, and a fight she could not be certain of winning. But I also knew something else, something that had been clarifying in me since the night I sat on my kitchen floor, that if I took the $2 million, I would spend the rest of my life knowing what I had allowed, what I had let them get away with, what it said about me. I would not spend my life knowing that. Later that week, I reached out to two people I trusted completely. The first was Diane Kowalski. We'd been friends since nursing school, and she had spent 20 years as a paralegal before her retirement. Diane was practical in the way that only people with decades of proximity to legal proceedings can be. Unsentimentally, usefully practical. She came over on a Friday evening with a bottle of wine and her reading glasses, and we sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours while I walked her through everything. She listened without interrupting. Then she put her glasses on and looked at the document Rebecca had sent me, Dr. Kwan's findings, and said, "Sarah, this is solid. Don't you dare settle." The second person was my neighbor, Carol Mendez, who lived in the apartment directly below mine and had been Emma's de facto aunt since we'd moved in. Carol worked in HR at a logistics company and possessed a quality I have always admired enormously. She was someone things didn't rattle. She reacted to my news, the $50 million, the forgery, all of it, with a steadiness that immediately made me feel less alone. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need someone to know," I said. "Someone who isn't a lawyer." She nodded. "Okay, then I know." That was enough. The loneliness of carrying a secret this large had been its own kind of weight, and having Diane and Carol know, having two steady, intelligent, genuinely good people in my corner, simply as human beings rather than legal strategists, made me feel, for the first time since this had all begun, that I was not fighting alone. Emma didn't know the details yet. I had kept the broad outlines vague, something about a legal matter involving your grandfather's estate. She accepted this with the incurious trust that teenagers extend to their parents' adult business, and I was grateful. I did not want her carrying this. She had enough to carry. School, the scholarship application, being 16 in a world that was already asking a great deal of 16-year-olds. The silver SUV had not reappeared since I filed the police report. Either the surveillance had stopped or they'd become more careful. Either way, I noted its absence and kept watching. They came on a Saturday. I didn't know they were in Columbus until I heard the buzzer from the street door at 2 in the afternoon. I pressed the intercom button and heard Brad's voice say, "Hey, Sarah, it's us. We flew in. Can we come up?" I stood at the intercom for a moment, one hand on the wall. The responsible part of me, the part that Rebecca had trained, said to tell them to contact her attorney. The human part of me, the part that still remembered a woman who had braided my hair on a summer porch, said something more complicated. I buzzed them up. They arrived at my door with flowers, yellow tulips, cheerful and incongruous. Brad was in a pressed shirt and slacks. Linda was smaller than I remembered, or seemed smaller. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan and her hair was silver now, entirely silver, and something in my chest moved in a way I hadn't expected at the sight of her face. She looked like my father, around the eyes. "We just wanted to see you," she said, and held out the tulips, and smiled. I let them in. I did not offer coffee. We sat in my living room, me on the armchair, Brad on one end of the couch, Linda on the other. I had placed my phone on the coffee table between us with the recording app running. I had told Rebecca this might happen, and she had confirmed that Ohio was a one-party consent state. Whatever was said in my apartment, I was entitled to record. For the first 10 minutes, it was almost convincing. Linda asked about Emma, said how much she'd grown. Brad commented on the apartment in a way that managed to be simultaneously complimentary and slightly diminishing. Cozy, really cozy, and asked about my work. He was good at it. He had the smooth, practiced sociability of someone in wealth management, the ability to make a transaction feel like conversation. Then Linda said, "Sarah, I know we've had a difficult few weeks, but I want you to hear something, and I want you to hear it from me, in person." She leaned forward slightly, and her voice took on a quality of wounded sincerity. "Your father and I were very close in those last years. You weren't there. I don't say that to be cruel. I know why you weren't there, and I understand. But someone had to be, and it was me. I was there every week. I held his hand when he was dying." Her voice caught just slightly. "He was confused in his last months, Sarah. He changed his mind constantly. The will. He didn't really understand what he was signing. He thought you still wanted nothing to do with him. He had a will drawn up 7 years before he died," I said. "Dr. Kwan's report." "Experts can be wrong," Brad cut in, very smoothly. "Experts can be hired to say what their clients want to hear. You know that, right? Whatever Rebecca Holt has told you, she has a financial stake in you pursuing this case." "As do you," I said, "in me not pursuing it." Brad's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, a slight tightening. He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable openness. "Sarah, we are your family. We're the only family you have left. Do you really want to spend years in litigation? Do you want Emma growing up watching her mother in a courtroom? Because that's what this is. That's what you're choosing." "Dad left me everything," I said. "Someone forged my signature to stop me from getting it." "Nobody forged anything," Linda said, and her voice had shifted now, the wounded sincerity replaced by something more brittle, something that pressed at its own edges. "You were contacted. You agreed. You received payment. You signed. I signed nothing." "You are confused," she said, with a precision in the word confused that was meant to land somewhere soft and uncertain inside me, that was designed to make me doubt my own memory, my own knowledge of what I had and hadn't done. I recognized it immediately because I had sat with patients who had received this same treatment from their families, the gentle, relentless suggestion that their perception of events could not be trusted. I was not confused. I was very, very clear. "I'd like you both to leave now," I said. Brad stood up first. He straightened his shirt, smiled, a thin, precise smile, and said, "You're going to regret this, Sarah. I want you to understand that. Not as a threat. As someone who knows how this kind of thing goes. You are going to spend years on this. You are going to spend money on this. And when it's done, you will have hurt people who loved you, and the outcome," he paused, "the outcome will not be what you're hoping." Linda picked up her purse. At the door, she turned and looked at me one last time, and for just a moment I saw something in her face. Not remorse, exactly, but a recognition. She knew I knew. She knew I could prove it. And the knowledge sat between us like something physical in the air. They left. I closed the door. I stood in my hallway and pressed both palms flat against the cool painted wall and breathed. My hands were shaking, not from fear exactly. Though there was fear, yes, there was absolutely fear because Brad was right that litigation was long and expensive and uncertain. And I was not a woman with unlimited resources, and they had legal teams and experience and resources I could only guess at. The fear was real. I didn't pretend it wasn't. But underneath the fear, something else had ignited. Something that the visit, the flowers, the wounded sincerity, the word confused, the careful threat delivered in the language of concern, had fueled rather than extinguished. Because they had come all the way to Columbus. They had bought flowers and pressed shirts. That meant they were afraid too. That meant they knew what Rebecca and I had, and they were afraid of it, and the fear had driven them here in person when their calls and texts and settlement offers had not worked. They were afraid. I pushed off the wall, picked up my phone, stopped the recording, and called Rebecca. "They came in person," I said when she answered. "I have all of it recorded." A pause, and then Rebecca said, "Good. Send me the file tonight." The trial began on a gray October morning, 8 months after Rebecca first filed the complaint. I remember the weather specifically because Columbus in October has a particular quality of light, that flat, pewter light that makes everything look more serious, more consequential, more real. I drove myself to the courthouse on 4th Street, parked in the structure 2 blocks east, and walked in carrying a leather portfolio and a thermos of coffee that I didn't end up drinking. Rebecca met me in the corridor outside courtroom 4B. She looked exactly as she always looked, composed, silver-haired, carrying an unreasonable amount of organized paper. She asked how I was. I said, "Ready." She nodded as if this was the correct answer. Linda and Brad were already seated at the opposing counsel's table when we entered. Linda was in a dark navy suit, her silver hair pulled back, her hands folded on the table in front of her with the careful stillness of someone who had prepared for this room. Their attorneys, 2 of them, a senior partner named Graydon and a junior associate who handled the documents, sat beside them. Brad was in a charcoal suit. He looked like he hadn't slept well. When he saw me come in, he held my gaze for one deliberate second before looking away. I sat down beside Rebecca and did not look at them again. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Mwangi, a woman in her mid-60s with the particular quality of stillness I associated with people who had heard every possible human story and were interested in facts. I found this immensely reassuring. Rebecca's opening argument was clean and methodical. She did not ask the jury to feel anything. She presented a timeline: Robert Calloway's will, its filing, the estate's value, Linda's contest, the appearance of the forged waiver, the disbursement irregularity that had revealed the truth, the 8 years between Robert's death and this courtroom. She laid it out the way you lay out evidence, piece next to piece next to piece, until the picture assembled itself. Dr. Kwan took the stand on the second day. He was in his mid-40s, quiet and precise, and he explained his findings with a composure that I imagined would be very difficult to shake. He walked the jury through the signature analysis, the comparative samples, the pressure inconsistencies, the slant of the letters, the rhythm of the pen strokes that was measurably different from every verified sample of my handwriting on file. He explained the notary stamp, the revoked license, the pattern of fraud associated with the same stamp across 3 other documents in Maricopa County in the same 18-month period. He said, in response to Rebecca's direct question, "In my professional opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, the signature on Exhibit 14 was not made by Sarah Marie Mitchell." Graydon cross-examined him for an hour and a half, and Dr. Kwan did not waver. Not once. The bank records came in through a financial analyst Rebecca had retained, a former auditor who walked through the flow of money from Robert's estate, the real property sales, the investment liquidations, the disbursements to the trust account, and, most critically, the partial distributions that had been made over the 8 years to the estate management account, controlled by Linda Calloway. The numbers were significant. Over 8 years, nearly $3 million in administrative fees and management costs had flowed from the estate to accounts associated with Linda and Brad. $3 million. I watched one of the jurors, a middle-aged woman in the second row with reading glasses and a yellow legal pad. Write something down and underline it. I watched her look at Linda. Then Linda took the stand. She was composed at first. Graydon walked her through a careful, rehearsed narrative. The devoted sister, the dutiful caretaker, the woman who had managed a complicated estate under difficult circumstances. She spoke about my father's decline with a convincing grief that I found both impressive and nauseating. She explained the administrative fees as reasonable compensation for years of management work. She explained the waiver as something I had agreed to in a phone call she claimed we had had, which she had followed up with documents she claimed to have sent to my address. Rebecca's cross-examination began gently. She established the basics: Linda's relationship to the estate, the length of her management, the accounts. Then she asked Linda to describe the phone call in which I had allegedly agreed to the waiver. Linda described it: the date, the approximate time, the nature of our conversation. Rebecca introduced Exhibit 31, my phone records for the month in question. The call Linda had described did not exist. There was no record of any call between Linda's number and mine on that date, nor on the 2 days on either side of it. Linda looked at the exhibit. She said that she had perhaps called from a different number. She could not remember which number she had used. It might have been a landline. She might have called from Robert's house. Rebecca introduced Robert's landline records. No call to my number in that month. Linda said perhaps it had been an email. Perhaps she had written to me. Rebecca introduced Exhibit 33, a request to the court for all electronic correspondence associated with the estate, which Linda and Brad's attorneys had been required to produce during discovery. There was no email from Linda to me regarding any waiver. There was, however, an email chain between Linda and Brad from 6 years ago, 12 days after the forged waiver was filed with the court. The subject line read, "Done." Brad's response, 3 words: confirmed, clean up. The courtroom was very quiet. Linda looked at that exhibit for a long time. When she looked up, she began to say something, a qualification, an explanation, and then stopped. Her attorney put a hand briefly on her arm. Brad was called to the stand the following morning. He was confident initially, smooth, the version of himself I recognized from the apartment, the wealth management voice, the practiced reasonableness. But Rebecca was not interested in his practiced reasonableness. She had the email chain. She had the records. She had a document from the revoked notary's former client list that included Brad Calloway's name as a referral. She asked him very calmly whether he had ever personally met with the notary who had stamped the forged waiver. Brad said he didn't recall. She introduced a billing record from the notary's office. Since obtained through the civil discovery process, that showed a meeting with B. Calloway at the address of Brad's Scottsdale office. Brad said, "That's not," then stopped. His attorney said something in a low voice beside him. Brad said, "I want to confer with counsel." Judge Mwangi allowed the recess. When we reconvened, something had shifted in the room. I could feel it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. I sat very still beside Rebecca and looked at the middle distance and thought about my father, not with bitterness in that moment, but with a strange, aching tenderness. He had written that will. He had left everything to me. Whatever had happened between us, whatever years we had lost, he had written my name in ink at the end of his life, and someone had tried to erase it. They would not. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I am told this is relatively swift for a civil case of this complexity. I spent those 2 days at work. It was the only way I could function, moving through my shifts with the particular focused calm that had sustained me through the entire 8 months of litigation. Diane called me at the end of each day to check in. Carol left soup outside my door on the first evening, the kind with the soft noodles that Emma had loved since she was a small child, and I sat at my kitchen table and ate it slowly and thought about patience and endings and what it means to wait for something you have already done everything in your power to earn. Rebecca called me at 11:23 on the second morning. They're back. I drove to the courthouse with Emma beside me. I had told her everything by then. The full story, from the $50 lottery ticket to the 3 whispered words to Dr. Kwan's testimony. I had waited until after Brad's collapse on the stand, until I felt certain enough not to be giving her hope that might be taken away. She had listened to the whole story in near silence, seated across from me at the kitchen table, and when I finished, she said, "Grandpa wanted us to have it." Not a question, a statement. I had nodded and she had nodded back, and that was, in its way, enough. We sat in the gallery, Diane and Carol on either side of Emma, me beside Rebecca at the plaintiff's table, and I watched Judge Mwangi enter and sit and arrange her papers, and I put my hands flat on the table in front of me the way I had pressed them against the wall of my hallway the day Linda and Brad had come with their tulips, and I breathed. The foreperson stood. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, a high school shop teacher, according to Rebecca's notes from jury selection. He held the paper with both hands. The verdict for the plaintiff on all counts. The forged waiver was ruled fraudulent and legally void. The original will of Robert James Calloway was affirmed as valid and controlling. The full estate, now $50,240,000, was legally Sarah Marie Mitchell's inheritance. Additionally, Linda Calloway and Brad Calloway were ordered to repay the estate the sum of $2,860,000, representing the management fees and unauthorized disbursements taken over 8 years, plus prejudgment interest, plus the full cost of plaintiff's legal fees and court costs. The judgment was approximately $3.4 million. The judge also formally referred the matter to the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office for review of criminal charges related to the forged document and the submission of fraudulent court filings. She did so in language that was measured and precise, the language of a court, but what it meant in plain terms was this: what Linda and Brad had done was not merely a civil wrong. It was a crime. Brad said something to his attorney. I couldn't hear it, but I saw his face, and it was no longer the face of the man in the press shirt who had come to my apartment with flowers and a performance of reasonableness. It was the face of someone who had run out of moves. Linda sat very still. She did not look at me. I found in that moment that I did not particularly need her to. I looked at Emma instead. She was gripping Carol's arm, and her eyes were bright, and when she caught my eye, she pressed her lips together in the particular expression she makes when she is trying very hard not to cry in a public place. A habit she had inherited, she informed me once, entirely from me. Outside the courthouse in the flat October light, I stood on the steps and called no one for several minutes. I just stood there. The cars moved on 4th Street. Someone dropped a coffee cup on the sidewalk below and swore. A pigeon landed on the railing next to me and regarded me briefly with its orange eye before deciding I was uninteresting. Emma appeared beside me and slipped her hand into mine. "So what do we do now?" she asked. I thought about it. The money in the account. The judgment. The house I had been looking at online for the past 4 months, a solid brick colonial in Bexley with a big kitchen and a backyard and a room with east-facing windows where Emma could study, the hospital where I had been for 12 years, the passport in my drawer that had exactly 1 stamp in it. "Whatever we want," I said. She leaned her head against my shoulder. We stood there on the courthouse steps in the October light, and for a moment the city moved around us as if we were the still point at the center of it. And everything that had happened, the lottery ticket, the notification, the 3 whispered words, the 8 years of absence, the forged signature, the silver SUV, the yellow tulips left on my coffee table, the jury foreperson holding his paper with both hands. All of it arranged itself into a shape I could finally see whole. Later, Rebecca called to walk through the post-judgment process, the formal transfer of funds, the liens against Linda and Brad's assets, the timeline for the criminal referral. She was thorough and professional, and at the very end of the call, entirely unlike herself, she said, "For what it's worth, Sarah, I've done this for 23 years. This one mattered." I thanked her. I meant it completely. We moved into the house in Bexley in January, Emma and I, and a moving truck, and more hope than I had carried in years. A big kitchen, a fireplace, east-facing windows in Emma's study, a backyard with an oak tree that had stood there for 60 years. I planted a garden in the spring for no reason other than that I could, and I stood at the kitchen window every morning with my coffee and watched things grow. I kept nursing. 3 shifts a week, on my own terms, because the work still meant something to me. Emma received her scholarship in April, earned entirely on her own merits, and began at Ohio State in the fall. In June, we flew to Portugal. I came home with 5 passport stamps instead of 1. Brad lost his license, his firm, and his entire career in finance. He relocated. We do not speak. Linda lost her house, her savings, and her standing in the community she had built over decades, and moved in with her sister in Tucson. She had spent 8 years maintaining a lie, and in the end, it had consumed precisely everything she had tried to protect. And me? I had the house, the garden, Emma's future, wide open ahead of her. A life, finally, with room to breathe. My father had tried to give me this. After everything, I had it. What did I learn? That silence enables theft. That the people closest to us are not always the safest. That a forged signature cannot erase what was written in love. And that the moment you stop doubting your own memory, your own name, is the moment everything changes. I was a nurse working double shifts, eating crackers in the dark, the night that notification changed everything. I didn't walk away from the fight. I walked through it. So here's my question for you. If you discovered that someone had stolen 8 years of your life, what would you do? Thank you for being here. Leave your answer below. It matters more than you know.